Good afternoon. I'm Reginald Wells, an executive in residence at American University's School of Public Affairs, and I teach in the Key Leadership Program. And it's truly my honor to be with you on this key webinar Wednesday. When I was asked to participate in this series, we were allowed to suggest topics, and the one that seemed most relevant at the time from the perspective of my boss, Dr. Malone, was this particular topic on fostering a culture of candor in difficult times. I have to be honest, I don't know that those of us who work in the public sector ever have times that are not difficult. The work is certainly not for the faint of heart, and it clearly requires us to be at the top of our game at all times. But we do live in some very interesting times, some what are referred to as VUCA times. They are volatile, uncertain, complex, even possibly chaotic, and they're ambiguous very often. And so leadership becomes a very, very important factor, and that's what we'll be talking about in part today. I'm proud of the fact that I have close to 40 years of public sector experience prior to coming to American University, and I got to do it at all levels, federal, state, and local. The last 15 were with the Social Security Administration as the Chief Human Capital Officer, but I've been at HHS. I did some time with the District of Columbia government, and started my public sector career in Essex County, New Jersey. I hail from Philadelphia. I was born and reared there, so I certainly know the urban experience, and went back to graduate school there at Temple University, where I got my PhD in social psychology. When I thought about this topic, what came to mind was a recent experience I had. In joining AU, I certainly came into an environment where you're encouraged to develop yourself and add to your toolkit. And I decided to take the leadership circle training, coaching training. And it was interesting because you had to do a 360. And in my case, given my career, I was encouraged to seek input from the beginning through the end of that 40-year stretch, and was successful in getting former bosses and colleagues and subordinates to weigh in. And after I got the results of it, I was, I have to admit, gratified by some of the feedback that I received. Had validated my own view that I had worked hard during those 40 years to build a reputation for integrity and honesty and effectiveness. But as with any 360-degree assessment, you are presented with areas that you could continue to work on. And the one that caught my attention and really contributed to my thinking deeply and reflecting back on this particular topic was the area of courageous authenticity. And while the folks who weighed in on me rated me higher than I rated myself, it still managed to grab my attention that in the public sector, because there's such an emphasis on loyalty and commitment to serve independent of what administration is in power, we find ourselves really operating in a way that gets the job done, that sometimes overlooks concerns you might have in delivering a particular initiative, because the bottom line is serving the public and getting the work done and following the directives of those who have the responsibility of directing us in those areas that require some sort of attention. So when I think back to this issue, I couldn't help but put this in as my first point to you this afternoon. Leadership is extremely important. I've had, on occasion, labor leaders who would argue with me about that, who suggested that perhaps we had too much at the top of organizations and not enough in the middle and the bottom. But the reality is we need everybody engaged and effective in getting the things done that very often are so complex to do. So this particular quote by O'Toole and Bennis is one that that resonated with me because of the times that we live in. And basically it says, we won't be able to rebuild trust in institutions until leaders learn how to communicate honestly and create organization where that's the norm. And so as we think about this topic and where we are as leaders in it, it also took me to this particular information from Bill George, who of course does a lot of work on authentic leadership and talks about pursuing a true north in terms of integrity and purpose. And so, of course, his 5 bullets, which serve as a guide for those of us who would like to be or think we are authentic leaders, is understanding our purpose, practicing our values, leading with heart, having empathy for the people who work with us and the people we report to and the people we work beside in carrying out the rather complex things we do in government, establish connected relationships. None of us are lone rangers. All of us in this very complex world we live in have to work through other people and with other people. And so that's a very important point that George makes. And then finally, demonstrating self-discipline. And I think most of us who lead hone in on that particular issue, because at the end of the day, we've probably had experiences with people who didn't show enough self-discipline. This question of character is kind of brought out by Joseph Federico's quote here, and I'll read it. Leaders are tested again and again throughout their careers, and the self-knowledge gained from these tests of character is the heart of leadership. The difference between success and failure is not skill, technique, credentials, or networking, or even experience. It is clarity about who one is. The self-knowledge is often the crucial factor enabling leaders to do their work, meet their responsibilities, and live rewarding and useful lives. And I think the one thing I would ask of all of you on the line today is, can you relate to that, that quote from Federico? Many times in my career, I feel like I've been tested as a leader on both my integrity and my ability to be effective in whatever task I was given. And you can't help but have that shape your character and make you at times question whether you are living up to the standards that you set. So this quote from Dr. King is one of my favorites. I think it's one that calls us all to conscience. And it reminds us that silence is complicity. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And so this issue of creating and nurturing a culture of candor fits very much into that dynamic. Are we existing in our roles in sort of a forced state of silence because we really don't want to hear the truth, like that famous line from A Few Good Men, the movie A Few Good Men. Can we handle the truth? And hopefully we can. Hopefully our leadership ability allows us to handle the truth, even when it's not a truth that we particularly want to hear. Here's another quote from Naomi Wolf, which I think is a real important one to think about as we think about this topic, because there is no shame in having your feedback rejected. Some people don't speak out because they really are struggling with how it might be received, particularly if they know their boss is not particularly interested in feedback from subordinates. And so she says, the only one thing is more frightening than speaking your truth, and that is not speaking it. That can be a serious problem, again, in these complex times we live in, when we need everybody's input to understand and resolve issues that we might have to deal with. And then this final one from Poetess Supreme Maya Angelou is illustrative as well, because I don't think any of us ever feel good about the woulda, coulda, shoulda game that we find ourselves playing when we don't speak out. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story. And so you don't want to be at the end of a career thinking about your legacy and wondering if you had been as forthright as you should have been, if you should have championed causes that were important at the time, but you didn't want to get between that issue and someone who didn't see things the way you did, but either were a peer or in a superior position to you within the hierarchy, and you're concerned about the consequences of your dissent. And then it brings me to this point, and this is advice that I give every group of aspiring leaders, whether they be supervisors, managers, or people aspiring to executive positions. You never want to be surrounded by yes people. They can be poisonous to your career. They can be poisonous to your ego. And so this quote from Samuel Goldwyn is really, I think, an illustrative one, because it really gets at a couple of different problems. You know, and Sam Goldwyn, that famed American film producer, said, "I don't want any yes men around me. I want everybody to tell me the truth, even if it costs them their job." Now, that is precisely the reason why some folks don't speak truth to power. If you are the messenger of what is perceived as bad news, you might get shot. And you don't want to be in that position. You don't want to jeopardize your career or your status within an organization or your position in a group that's important to you because of the identity that you have with that group. And so it's really a multi-pronged dynamic. It's a trap in the sense that if you surround yourself with yes people, chances are you will be encouraged to go in directions that may not have been the right direction to go. You might drive yourself right off a cliff listening to the people encouraging you and patting you on the back, knowing full well that what they are encouraging you to do may not necessarily be the thing that you need to be doing. And then there's the problem that Goldwyn speaks to at the end of this quote about basically punishing the truth teller. And the paradox here is that he may not want to be surrounded by yes people, but by the very fact that he would fire them for telling him the truth pretty much assures him that he's going to have nothing but yes people around. And that's not something you ever want to do. So in nurturing a culture of candor, one of the sources that I would submit to you today is from an article by O'Toole and Dennis, and they offer these particular steps, cutting to the chase. Telling the truth, you know, being known as a truth teller, being known as someone who doesn't mince words when it comes to that particular value. Encouraging people to speak their truths. It's one thing if your truth is the only truth and you're in a position of leadership, you may suppress other truths that need to be spoken. Don't hesitate to reward contrarians. And I'm not suggesting that you reward people who are basically drama kings and queens and always want to keep something going and always want to be challenging authority. But when people who you know are of good character and committed to the mission and function of the organization come forward with information that they consider to be factual and relevant to whatever the issue is, don't criticize them for that. Thank them for bringing things to your attention. People who never want to get bad news will also not get some of the news they need to get to be successful or to survive in a particular leadership situation. Practice having unpleasant conversations. Most of us have taken, by the time we get to the executive level, courses in crucial confrontations and crucial conversations, and those are very important things to do. You can prepare yourself for those uncomfortable conversations, those undiscussable issues, if you simply pay attention to some of the tools of the game in that regard. And then diversify your sources of information. As we have seen in our society, our polarization is in part a function of the fact that people go to the same reliable sources for their information. And as a result of that, they often are pitted against one another if their sources of information are divergent. And then admit your mistakes. Most followers, most people who you will lead will feel much better about you if you appear to be human. If you admit your vulnerabilities, if you admit a mistake when you make it, that's not such a bad thing. To be infallible as a leader is probably not to be honest about your leadership ability. Build an organizational agriculture that supports candor. Excuse me, that is one of the things that many organizations don't put enough attention into. Making sure the communication channels are open and flow within your organization so that people aren't afraid to come forward with mistakes they make, with problems they find when they are implementing what you've asked them to do. Be open to the information flowing in your organization. And the last bullet that Bennis and Toole and Bennis share with us is that, set the information free. Let the information flow. If you are a just and fair and capable leader, you won't have any problems dealing with the facts of the situation.
Hey,
so
Reg.
Yes.
Hi, sorry to jump in. We actually have
Right.
two amazing insights from our guests today, as well as two.
Oh, fantastic.
We have one from Dustin. If you get fired for demonstrating candor, remember, you can find another job, but you cannot find another soul. And we have another one from Sean earlier.
I love it.
I believe all good leaders will eventually come to crossroads that calls upon them to take a stand, which speaks well to what you've been talking about. We have two questions. One from Dana, question on how do we navigate learning and failing on a culture where failure is not an option? And then another question from Erica, to the point about thinking contrarians, language matters too. Can Dr. Wells speak to reimagining how we view people, for example, contrarian versus ideas people?
Well, let me start with the last question first. All contrarians, that's a label, and it's one that was used in the literature. All of us have ideas. All of us bring value. If you've selected the right people to be on your team, or you've inherited people and you've put them through a critique to see if they're the right people, and you have retained them because they're going to have ideas. And it is kind of human nature to defer to the person in the superordinate position, the person who has the S on their chest, the supervisory S on their chest, or the executive label. But we all bring value, we all have ideas, and it's when you get the collection of those ideas together that we usually come up with our best strategies and plans for pursuing whatever challenge we're facing. Remind me of the question before that one. I've lost it.
No worries. The other question is, how do we navigate learning and failing on a culture where failure is not an option?
Okay, the reality is, even in those missions where failure is not an option, and in government we have many of those, I think that is really what often separates public sector leadership from private sector leadership. Now, failure in a private sector situation might, cost you your job, and it might even have dire consequences depending upon the nature of the private sector work that you do. But it's almost certain that in government today, if you fail at your job, someone or something is going to be broken or unresolved in a way that is going to have consequences for people. And if you take one of the most visible occupations in government, the Secret Service, they do operate clearly with a zero failure standard, and yet they can't do that work without making mistakes. Now, what they can't afford is for those mistakes to result in the ultimate failure. But they have to be honest about the failures that they may experience along the way, because that's the only way they can mitigate those situations. And sometimes they have no control over those things that are coming down the pike at them. Like most of us in these federal or public sector jobs, we don't control enough of the variables to avoid the problems. And you can't address problems without occasionally making a mistake. And if you have leaders who are totally intolerant of honest mistakes and well-intentioned activities that often result in perhaps not accomplishing all that was intended, we wouldn't have any employees in any jobs. Most of us get to a position of mastery in whatever area we work in because we have failed, we have survived those failures, and we don't make those mistakes into the future. And so that would be the way I would respond to that. So these are additional tips. Let me go back, I advanced too quickly. These are additional tips. They're really play somewhat off of the ones that were offered a moment ago. Encourage your employees to share information openly and offer candid feedback as appropriate. Reach out to all levels of the organization to solicit intelligence. Don't simply solicit intelligence from that layer that's just below you in the hierarchy. Accept and even welcome troubling information when employees come forward with it, because you want to recognize, some would refer to them maybe as contrarians, but you want to recognize their candor, their honesty, their integrity in bringing that information forward. Reinforce and incentivize candor to surface unpleasant news and information so you can resolve those issues as early in the process as possible and they don't fester. Create internal systems designed to ensure good information flows to those who need it. If you don't have a vehicle for getting information from all levels below you in the organization, or all parts of the organization even, where you don't have necessarily direct authority, that's part of what being a good team player and having an influence sphere that goes beyond your immediate area of responsibility. And then make it crystal clear to everyone that they are not interested in happy talk and false reassurances. It's one of the controversies right now with the president's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. He has expressed a desire to be a cheerleader, but some have accused him of engaging in happy talk in a way that prevented people from paying attention and understanding the gravity of the clinical situation. And that's always a problem, I guess, for any leader. You have to achieve a balance between what's happy talk and what's being honest with the people who depend on you for information. And don't forget, in all of this, you're leveraging your emotional intelligence. This is a very important point I want to make, because it is a very interesting thing that, emotional intelligence is double-edged. If people read you accurately as a leader who is not good with being contradicted or given information that's not good news, they're going to read, pretty well that maybe I shouldn't go to them with this stuff. Maybe I need to keep this to myself until I'm absolutely positively sure that I know what I'm talking about. And that situation may be overcome and overtaken by events. And you could have gotten early intelligence that you choked off unwittingly because you send the signal that don't bring me any bad news. I don't want to hear any bad news. I've had enough bad days. Keep that to yourself, unless it's, we're really up against it. And that puts the judgment back on them. They're going to question whether they're bringing you something that absolutely has to be dealt with, and you may be behind the 8 ball before you even know it. And so it's very important to be, EI is a double-edged sword because savvy employees understand the vulnerabilities that they sometimes are taking on when they come forward. There are the reasons why information flow and transparency get stunted. There probably can come up with specific examples of this in your own experience, but fear is the primary one. And it's not always the fear of if I give bad news, I'll be the messenger that gets shot for bringing the news. It's also, I want to be valued by this leader. I'm part of this group and I don't want to be raining on the parade of this group. I have an identity in this organization for being loyal and committed and going through a brick wall for my boss. And even though I think there's some issues here that need attention, I'm going to plow through them because, you know, I want to continue to be in a good standing with the people in charge. And that's unfortunate when people fear in that way. Hoarding information as a source of power. Many of us baby boomers, as a good example, I am one, came up at a time when the ascension to leadership was typically through some technical expertise. And it's still going on, but it was clearly the case in that generation of workers. If you were the top person in a particular area, chances are you were going to supervise that area one day. And so whether you had good leadership skills or not, because there wasn't the same emphasis placed on really honing leadership as a real skill and art. And so sometimes hoarding information is kind of second nature to employees who value their technical expertise and feel that they've ascended because of it. And then the last bullet there is one that I had a real good experience with when I first joined Social Security. It was at a time when most agencies in government were still trying to automate a lot of their HR functions. And there was a function the agency had been attempting to automate for a number of years, working with another federal agency. And the amount of money that was going into this project was getting to be really questionable. And I happened to take over at a time where, coming in as a new executive, I could raise that question. You know, what have we spent? What more do we need to spend in order to get this deliverable? And when it became clear to me that it was obviously not a case of getting the bang for the buck, that we were being used for pretty much research and development, I went to my commissioner and I laid the facts out to her. And I was fortunate because she was a leader who believed that you should, you know, accept the sunk costs, not to put your agency in jeopardy, not to put your budget out there to be pillaged. And so we were able to protect the budget by acknowledging through my going forward and speaking truth to power that these sunk costs were as far as we were going to go, and we were going to wait for a future time when we could get what we were paying for. The other thing I would want you to pay some attention to is this issue of a leader's action logic. And this is a quote from Rook and Torbert. You may be familiar with it. What differentiates leaders is not so much their philosophy of leadership, their personality, or their style of management. Rather, it's their internal action logic, how they interpret their surroundings and react when their power of safety or safety is challenged. Relatively few leaders, however, try to understand their own action logic, and fewer still have explored the possibility of changing it. So I put this in. I wanted to bring your attention to it because the reality is, if your immediate supervisor is an opportunist in using the labels that Rook and Torbert refer to, and others allude to, sometimes giving them different labels than that. If your boss is an opportunist, then one way to perhaps persuade him or her that this is not a good way to go is to point out what they might lose in plowing forward on something that is not particularly appropriate or desirable, given what you know and what others have suggested about that course of action. By the same token, if that person is a transformational leader or a strategic leader, you might be able to appeal to them because they get the fact that their view of the world is not the only one, and that they have to invite in other points of view in order to have the best picture of what the solution might be for a particular problem. Thad Allen has talked about that extensively in the work he did in the Gulf on 2 separate occasions, with the hurricane and then with the oil spill. And as he points out, no one individual is going to have enough intellect and knowledge of the technical areas or the various strategies that can be applied to a situation. And you need people bringing divergent points of view, all committed to resolve a situation to get the best results that you're likely to get. And so understanding your action logic and understanding the action logic of those with whom you're working is really important when you're up against it on an issue and there's tremendous differences of opinion about what's going to be successful. Let me pause for a moment there and invite any other thoughts that people might have.
Yes, Reg. We have a lot of amazing comments as well as a couple of questions. I'll read through the comments really quickly. We have a comment about how this is very much in line with building psychological safety, where people feel they can voice their opinions without fear of negative consequences. We have 2 questions, one from Ruth Zaplin, Dr. Ruth Zaplin, about how, yes, speaking truth to power may cost you your job, as you say, but that may not be an option, especially today. So what is the best way to manage that tension and still maintain your integrity?
Okay, in response to the first point, yes, absolutely. The neuroscience tells us that our brains are sort of hardwired toward a negative bias. We tend to I think the reference is the Velcro Teflon phenomenon, where bad news sticks to us like Velcro, and good news we take for granted, and it flows off of us like Teflon. So there's a tendency to be afraid in these situations, to think about the consequences more than we may be allowing our integrity to drive us to understand that at the end of the day, you got to do the right thing, and you got to do what's right. And so, and of course, Ruth is always good at creating, handling the dissonance that most of us feel often in these roles where we have to make these judgments. And you can certainly utilize mindfulness for that, introspection, consulting with others who understand you, who you trust, and they can give you perspective. I've had good colleagues and friends talk me off of ledges on a number of occasions because they knew what my intentions were. They knew what my integrity was all about, and they gave me permission to question, but also to remind me that my judgments typically were on point and typically did not stray from my values. And so reflecting on those things and having people who can help you through those moments when there is dissonance and you're wondering, is this the right time? Usually people know they have to say something at some point. They're just trying to figure out what's the right time. And unfortunately, they can procrastinate to the point where it's overtaken by events, and they're in that woulda, coulda, shoulda phase where they're not feeling very good about themselves because they could have been a voice of reason at a critical point.
Thank you, Reg. And one last question from Sean. How do you convince an organization of the value of honing leadership skills, particularly in a technology environment that values scientists and engineers who tend toward a different way of thinking?
Interesting question. I think a very good question, and a very relevant one. But from my experience, Sean, what I would say to you is that I've had the honor in the key leadership program to be in groups of scientists from different agencies, various agencies, and yes, they have a tendency to think in a very different way than perhaps, you know, particularly if they're from the hard sciences, the physical sciences and the like, from the social scientists, who acknowledge, you know, varying shades of gray comfortably. And the fact of the matter is, I have found both groups of aspiring leaders to be open to perfecting their and honing their leadership ability. I've been remarkably impressed with the degree when you get them to let their hair down, so to speak, and to speak candidly about some of the situations they find themselves in. They are quite remarkably open to seeing things in a different way and acknowledging that how the task of leading people can be a dirty test tube. That you know, in the sciences, you know, you want to, one of the primary principles is you don't do experiments with dirty test tubes. But in the reality of leading people, you're usually provided with little more than dirty test tubes, because you can't control the variables to a degree that things are predictable. And so I have found them to be remarkably open to the unpredictability of some of the situations they find themselves in, and very open to receiving insights and information that will help them weather those, and they're uncomfortable situations for them, as they are for all of us who are in leadership roles. They embrace them pretty well, in my experience.
Thank you, Reg. That's all the questions that we have for now. We have just one more comment about how leadership is not an exact science, and we'll end with that.
Okay. And it is not. The people issues are messy by perhaps by design. Okay, I want to go back to one of the points I made at the top about my personal interest in this topic. And this is what you see on the slide is the definition of courageous authenticity as the leadership circle defines it. And it's the leader's willingness to take tough stands, bring up the undiscussables, that is risky issues the group avoids discussing, and openly deal with difficult relationship problems. Now, when I got my 360, I read the results, and some of my evaluators were brutally honest. This was one of the areas where I got some brutal feedback. Didn't I, Ruth? And so it's an area that I think warrants a little explanation from me, because while I felt good about the rating I got, it really did trigger my thinking about all of those tough situations I found myself in over the 40 years. And did I raise a voice when I should have? Was I willing to weigh in with the undiscussable topics when I should have? And if I didn't do that, what can I learn from my assessment, my retrospective assessment of that? And so what I'm going to show you now, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much, are the slides that kind of put this into context for you. So these are the creative leadership summary dimensions that the leadership circle acknowledges relating. These are the creative techniques that effective leaders use: relating, self-awareness, authenticity, systems awareness, and achieving. And these are the reactive leadership summary dimensions, the styles that people will adopt when they revert back to some of their fundamental defensive positions as leaders: complying, protecting, and controlling. And what's interesting about this list is that I recall some 40 years ago, when I was first starting to get into leadership, that most of the leadership training you got basically said, this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be protecting the organization, controlling the employees, making them comply with directives, and you should be complying with them as well. And it's just fascinating how we've evolved in our leadership thinking. These are the creative leadership competencies that go along with those dimensions. And you'll notice on the third bullet, authenticity, you have integrity and courageous leadership. So that's where I was focused as it relates to this topic in my own thinking. And then these are the reactive ones: complying, conservative, pleasing, belonging, passive. And this is where, if you're not careful, government will encourage you to be. There are those leaders who are not as open to hearing the truth, and therefore will use these leadership styles to try to avoid the pain that they may feel if they are confronted with some of their limitations. This is a quote from Dr. King, which I love Dr. King's quotes. I guess in the time that he did his civil rights work, really had a moral imperative to leave us with a lot of very, very useful insights. And this is one of those. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. And so as I thought about my courageous authenticity, I asked myself, was I a person who tried to mold consensus when I had a real interesting dispute or concern about a course of action that we were being asked to move out on? And I won't answer the question for you now, but I will move on with this. So it does, require you at times to take a position of dissent, but you can take a position that is loyal dissent. It kind of falls into the category, I think you've heard the expression, you can disagree without being disagreeable. A lot of it has to do with the work you do in advance of dissenting. It begins with that first bullet, and gets back to the action logic. Know your boss. Know how the person you report to handle situations. What are their particular competencies, and what strategies and styles do they operate from? Are they a transformational leader? Are they a servant leader? Are they someone who invites different ways of looking at a situation because they understand that there's more than one way to perhaps come at a problem? Or are they people who are so narcissistic and thin-skinned that they don't want to hear a different point of view, but they want you to worship at the shrine of their ideas? The second bullet, provide alternatives to the position you are challenging. Most of us as leaders have been in a position where subordinates come to us with a problem and they haven't done any thinking about how they might recommend we solve the problem. And so, make people do their due diligence. Careful, and you need to do yours before you go forward. Carefully choose your time to challenge. In an all-hands meeting, it is not the time to embarrass your supervisor by pointing out that what they want to do doesn't make any sense to you. You have to have more emotional intelligence than that. Recognize when you have pushed to the limit. We've all been in stressful situations where hearing the dissent for the 100th time isn't helpful. And sometimes you are moving out on stuff that you may not totally agree with, but it isn't immoral, illegal, or something that is going to challenge your integrity. If it's not unethical, illegal, or immoral, and one of my bosses used to say, and not fattening, then you should do it as an employee. Always remember that you may be wrong. You may even be ideologically biased. We all have biases, both conscious and unconscious, and you have to be honest enough with yourself. You have to have the ability to reflect on that and take into consideration that you are presenting a particular point of view, that you may be the only one who has it. Accept defeat graciously. Don't pout and be a bad sport if your sage wisdom doesn't carry the day. We've all been there where we felt like we had the solution and nobody could see it but us. And sometimes, again, if it isn't illegal, immoral, and unethical, you just have to grin and move along with the team. Choose your issues carefully. Don't come at people in authority with a dissent on everything and anything. First of all, you're obviously not being honest about the situation or with yourself. And so just think it through. Do your homework and think it over carefully before you challenge. Clearly take ownership for your dissent. Don't blame it on others. Don't act like, this really wasn't my idea after you put it out there and you don't get the warm, fuzzy reaction you may have wanted to get. That doesn't accrue to your character. Don't personalize the challenge. Focus on the issue. Take that Joe Friday approach. Just the facts, man, just the facts. Be objective and balanced in your analysis of the issue. Again, we all have our biases. We all have our points of view. They may not be the same as another colleague's, but that's where honest debate and discourse come in. Don't paint your supervisors into a corner by challenging their judgment in public. Again, don't choose an all hands meeting as the place for this conversation, and do not expect radical change in opposing views. And that bullet speaks to, I think, the nature of government. Government is a place where things are done mostly through an incremental process. And it is often very frustrating. It is often, takes us to our wits' ends, because we just understand that with a little more attention, a few more resources, we can get to exactly where we need to be. But we don't control all of those variables, and sometimes you have to basically go with what you can go with at the time, because the organization or the people in charge are willing to move out at least that far on your ideas. So there are some ethical enablers that can assist you when you're doing your dissent, and I broke these down into two categories. They're the things you control, and they're the things that the organization context may be helpful in when you come forward. So finding your allies. I mean, if you're going to go out on a limb, not that you will want to find them so you can blame them, but it may be that you can marshal an alliance that is more convincing to the person in power than you as a solo player. Getting more information is always out there for you. Sometimes the people above you are required to do things for reasons unbeknownst to you. And you may never get that information, but if you have a relationship with them, you may get enough information to recognize that perhaps I may have a better idea, but it isn't possible given the politics or the circumstance that I'm trying to affect. Understanding the stakeholders that are involved. You need to know the players and what's at stake here. Reframing the problem as opportunity instead of reproach. Reframing is a very effective strategy very often when you're trying to get people to understand or see a situation the way that you understand it. And how you select and sequence the audiences can be very, very important. If you want to get to the head of the agency, how you present these issues further down in the organization may result in a groundswell of support for the guidance that you and the sage wisdom that you bring. And then on the organizational side, understand the policies, values, and practices of the organization and how they may inform your argument. The ethics, understanding the debate and the discussion that's been going on, perhaps even prior to your involvement in the issue. Existing mechanisms for open debate and discussion. Sometimes people have all hands meetings to garner points of view from people. They certainly have work sessions along that line. You want to make sure that you are in those or get invited to those or have people who you've elicited, maybe allies, who can carry that same message. On the control side, proceeding incrementally. Unfortunately, if there's a serious problem, sometimes time is of the essence, and you don't have the opportunity to do it incrementally. Questioning assumptions and rationalizations through a very methodical process can often raise the alarm or the sensitivity to whatever you think the concerns are, finding a win-win solution. Once had an executive tell me there's no such thing as a win-win solution. And I really troubled me in my ongoing work with that executive. I think it's interesting that that executive, crashed and burned. And it's not a surprise to me, because if you don't get along with your peers, if you don't have the ability to compromise or understand other points of view, it can lead to your downfall. I'm appealing to shared purpose and values. Very often, we're in organizations that at least profess to have lofty goals, and if we can sometimes bring everybody back to that point of view, it's helpful. And then using your strengths, whatever they are, for persuading people. And if you are a subject matter expert, perhaps it is that technical knowledge that you bring to bear, or if you're someone that understands compromise, perhaps you can, in negotiating, perhaps you can get people to make a slight detour that avoids disaster. On the organizational side, having mechanisms like an ombudsman sometimes, or a technical expert within the part of the organization that is charged with maybe the technical side of whatever issue is at stake here. The history of the organization and doing the right thing. Many of us are in organizations where there's been tremendous integrity throughout the leadership, but where that has been clearly demonstrated, you can sometimes lean on that. And then modeling by leaders of ethical behaviors. So this was Stephen Carter's. He's a law professor at Yale, and he had these 6 criteria for speaking truth to power. He said it must be truthful, it must do no harm to innocence, it must not be self-interested, it must be the product of moral reflection, the messenger must be willing to pay the price, and it must not be done out of spite or anger. And I think, as you're thinking through whether or not you want to go forward with dissent or speak truth to power where you don't think it's going to be welcomed as much as it should, you may want to think about these things. Before whistleblowing, ask yourself these questions. Is the violation serious enough to warrant the risk of going external to you and the organization? Are you fully prepared for the action to become known externally and for your sense of heroism to mutate into perceived betrayal? Are you sure of your facts? Are you sure your perceptions are reasonable? Are you sure leadership is not already aware and trying to correct the situation? Is your motive purely in the public interest? Are you ready to accept the consequences if you misperceive the situation and are wrong? And then this quote from James Dennert, I think, kind of says it all, because most of us are not driven to whistleblow. That is always, obviously, an ultimate option, but we saw in recent history that being a whistleblower has its sometimes very severe peril involved. And so, and the fact of the matter is, most of the dissent comes short of whistleblowing, because I'd like to believe most leaders are open to at least some criticism, and many, I believe, do want to have their coattails pulled if they are about to do something that is not going to be good for the organization, and perhaps not good for them as a leader. But Dennard said most acts of courage don't come from whistleblowers or organizational martyrs. Instead, they come from respected insiders at all levels who take action, be it campaigning for a risky strategic move, pushing to change an unfair policy, or speaking out against unethical behavior, because they believe it's the right thing to do. Their reputations and track records enable them to make more headway than those on the margins or outside the organization could. When they manage the process well, they don't necessarily pay a high price for their actions. Indeed, they may see their status rise as they create positive change. And so, while I have seen people speak truth to power and get penalized for it, I've also seen many others speak truth to power the right way and have that power source buy into the truth that they speak and avoid a situation that was avoidable. Aristotle said that courage is the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees the others. And I've given a lot of thought to this and how much courage is a foundational quality in leading. Competently courageous people learn how to be courageous with effort and practice. They come from all levels of the organization. More often than not, they create positive change without ruining their careers. They create the right conditions for action by establishing a strong internal reputation and by improving their fallback options in case things go poorly. And they choose their battles carefully. They discern whether a given opportunity to act makes sense in light of their values, timing, and broader objectives. They maximize the odds of in-the-moment success by managing the messaging and emotions. They follow up to preserve relationships and generate commitment. I want to leave you with a couple of final quotes. Again, as I said, I love Dr. King's quotes. What do you want your legacy to be? Dr. King said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. And so it's not simply the measure of a man, but the measure of a woman as well. In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And so as you think about whether or not you should speak out, understand that sometimes by not speaking out, you leave your friends hanging. You leave people you care about under your charge in precarious situations. And that's not leadership. That's not courageous leadership. That concludes my remarks. I think I stopped right on the money. If you want to be in touch with me, this is my contact information here at American University. And with that, Lamana, I'm open for additional questions and comments.
Yes, thank you so much for such an amazing presentation, Reg. We have a lot of people who are sorry they have to leave early because of a 1 o'clock meeting, but they really enjoyed the presentation. Lisa said, a very poignant quote from Deterred. We've seen recent examples of this during COVID-19 response. We also have George from our Key family saying, hi from George, any comment on the captain of the aircraft carrier who raised critical health issues on his ship, got demoted, and then led to the self-implosion of the Navy Secretary?
Yes. Not totally resolved issue, but I guess the president said yesterday he was going to look into it personally, that even though he may have interpreted the captain's behavior as a bad day, I don't know if I agree with that, but I'm not a military guy. So, chain of command is important. I get it. I understand it. But if the crew, I've always been led to believe by military leaders that the most valuable weapon in the military is the soldier, sailor, Marine, aviator. Coast Guard member. And so if that's true, then you want to protect those people. Maybe not at all cost as in betraying the country, but you certainly want them attended to. And what he did in bringing attention to the infection on his ship, I think most of us as lay people would consider admirable. And certainly the crew did when he left that ship. I saw the video of them cheering him for his courage and speaking truth to power. And so that would be what I have to say about that.
All right, well, I think that's all that we have for now. If you have any other additional questions, please be sure to email Dr. Reg at wells@american.edu. You can also email us at key@american.edu as well. We just want to give a quick, amazing thank you to Dr. Wells for your amazing presentation, and thank you so much for tuning in for this week's Webinar Wednesday. Thank you so much.
And may I make one last comment?
Of course.
I want to thank you for your technical support, you, Bree, and Jennifer. I also want to express to everyone on the call that I hope you are coping with the pandemic as well as you can. And I hope you and yours will remain safe and sound during this time. It's a very disconcerting and challenging time for, I think, all of us. But this is one of those occasions where it is so important that we pull together as a team and deal with this invisible enemy. So good luck to all of you with that. And thank you so much for spending a few minutes with me and allowing me to share my perspectives. Take care.